so the interesting question that I have is, so if we rewind the clock back to that day where you get the phone call saying, "Hey, we want you to do X-Men," and probably in your head, from what I understand, like the most rudimentary understanding of what the X-Men were at the time. And yet, when you fast forward now to 2024 and you look at the overall umbrella of X-Men in pop culture, X-Men the animated series is such an integral part of that. It bred more than one generation of X-Men fans who can like literally trace their geological fandom back to X-Men the animated series. Do you ever take time to sort of like ponder like where your work sits in terms of the impact it's had in the overall like X-Men world?
That's pretty intense, but I see like four or five stages in getting from 1963 when Stan and Jack, it was January, whatever it was in 63, when the first book came out and people saw this. And to be honest, I think Stan was just asked, look, DC's doing a bunch of group books, come up with a group book and come up with some reason for that they're a group. Okay. So he and Jack came up with this wonderful setting. Then it didn't do so well, kind of faded off after 7 years, and it went into reprints. And I think part of that is that at the time in the early 60s, it was very kind of white bread American male. There were, six young white American guys and a girl that came in to make coffee. So it was of its time, and it brought the mutant question to the fore, which was really good. But okay, so then it's kind of faded and had some wonderful artists and writers working on it, but it just didn't quite catch on. Then in 74, 75, Marvel decides to redo it. And of all things, I don't know if you guys know the story, Len Wein, who was there in the middle of it, told us a story that an accountant came to them in late 74 and said, look, guys, the reprints of X-Men are selling well overseas, not here, but in various foreign countries. If you decide to do a reboot, because there's been talk about it, why don't you make the cast more international? And so they went to Len and said, okay, start coming up with mutant characters from other countries. So the first person he comes up with was Wolverine from Canada, and he puts him in a Hulk book. And then he said, oh, come up with some more stuff. So he and Dave Cockrum, okay, Storm from Africa and Nightcrawler from Germany and Colossus from Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're building this United Nations of characters as they're building the world for the reboot. And so the reboot comes out in 1975, the new X-Men 1. And that was just like, a big second stage of the rocket. I think that put it in a position to where it could become the thing that became this international thing that it's grown to it by 2024. They hadn't done that if it was the old Stan and Jack thing. I don't think it would have made it. So they did that, and there's 15 years of that, and the book's building and building and becoming a really popular, like the most popular book on the planet. And then we get a chance. Okay, Hollywood doesn't like dealing with Marvel. I don't think it works out here. Nobody believes. Okay, but okay, I think, let Marvel see that it could be audiovisual, that the heroic stories could be told in a way that was different from comic books, and it would work, and it would be special, and you could love the characters without having it to be a comic, because they just weren't buying it out here. And so we gave it that, and we gave it this, okay, it could work in all media. We proved it. And all the fans, and I think, the internet coming on in the 90s and all this international attention. So it went from this little comic book to a bigger comic book, but still this little tiny corner of pop culture to the center of pop culture. We were laughing. When we were growing up, there wasn't a comic there wasn't a comic superhero genre of movies growing up. Once every 10 years, it'd be a Superman movie or a Batman movie, and that was it. It was not central to the culture. And now suddenly, half the box office receipts of the last 30 years have been superhero adaptations. And that is astounding to us.
And I will take it to the grave that I believe good old X-Men the animated series was the bridge for a generation of fans to then become the live action audience fans for the films and the films are now $1 billion industry.
Mhm.
And we need to, I don't know if we've mentioned her yet. We mentioned Sydney Iwan, the executive at Fox, but the president of Fox Kids,
Margaret.
woman named Margaret Lesh, and she deserves all the credit because when the show, she put her job on the line to get the show on the air and it hit. And then as she would go to the folks at the Fox live action department, there's a big audience out there. You need to start thinking about a live action film. And it wasn't until like 2 years when this show's off that they come up with the X-Men movie, the first one, big hit. And from that begat Marvel's bankrolling of successful films, including Iron Man and Thor, and everything else for good or ill. But I do believe X-Men Animated is kind of responsible
And
for that, for discovering, creating an audience.
and she gets all that. She hired the entire creative crew. She hired the animation house.
Mhm.
She, for like 7 or 8 years, had been trying to get this on the air.
Oh my God.
No one would listen to her when she was working for Marvel. So she got it on. She protected us when
Yes.
people were trying to change the show. So it's all her doing.
Mhm.
It really is all her doing. And once it got a life of its own, and it was a hit, it was self-perpetuating. But it's just like then there was no struggle involved. There was no sacrifice. There was no effort. But she put in the 10 years of trying and then backing us to get it to the point where it was successful. And it was really, that is the one central person in this whole story. I think more than Stan and Jack. I mean, it's Margaret making this all happen.
Yeah, and I'm going to 100% agree with your theory because I think that it doesn't get credited enough because like when X-Men the animated series was airing, like we had gotten ourselves a live action Ninja Turtles movie. And people were like banging the sabers for years, like we need a live action X-Men. It took so long for it to happen, but when X1, the first X-Men movie came out, it predated the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie.
Mhm.
And it proved empirically that Marvel superhero movies make money. And I think that if that first movie flops, the entire landscape after that changes. And it was
Yeah.
because there was such a upswell, I firmly believe a fandom from X-Men the animated series to see this live action, that it was kind of like, it was sort of like the crustacean slowly crawling onto the beach and growing and growing and eventually spreading its wings and flying, because I firmly believe that's the path it took.
And the X-Men movie, they could have picked from the same 29 different X-Men
That
that
we
you
had
had
to
to
pick
choose
from.
from. And they picked the same ones from the X-Men animated series. And that
And
meant a lot to me.
And we know the screenwriter David Hayter that got credit for the first two because a lot of people wrote on both of them, but David earned the credit on both of the first two movies. He said, "Yeah, the director never touched a comic book. He just watched our show. There was no, and I think part of that is that it was easier for him because he's a filmmaker. He's thinking like a filmmaker, but it was also okay. This worked for the international audience. Why should we mess with this? Why should I go back and talk to crazed fans about the 30 years of books and find other details to use? Let's run with what people now in the world think the X-Men are. So it's kind of a default position, but that is what they did. So I don't think we're making up stuff that they depended on our show. That's what they worked from.
Yeah, they didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They were like, everyone who's going to be seeing this movie anyway, watch the cartoon. Let's just make them happy. So I wanted to ask you guys, because Finch and I have both been mentioning how much X-Men meant to us. We've been talking about how much it meant to everyone else as well. When you guys were growing up, was there a show or a movie that meant as much to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I tried to think the things that from younger, because this was age 11 and a half when
And for me, age 8.
when Star Trek came on. So that was a big one. Earlier than that, I'd love to watch TV with my dad, and Bullwinkle was one of the things. Really fast paced,
Yeah.
really clever. No budget. I've since met some people that worked on it, and yeah, it was just, and it was so clever. Warner Brothers cartoons,
Oh my God.
theatrical cartoons from the 30s and 40s, were just so clever. I wasn't a Disney person the way a lot of people were, but so Warner cartoons, Bullwinkle, Mad Magazine,
Yes.
Three Stooges.
Yep.
I mean, Marx Brothers, that kind of stuff. My dad loved old movies, and so we saw a lot of them. I got very much support for that, for heroic, like mythological books and old movies. So thank my dad for that.
And kind of me the same sort of way with my family when I was growing up, but also a little bit later, Monty Python's Flying Circus, huge impact on me. And yeah, basically the same stuff. I think we all learned classical music from the Warner Brothers cartoons, did we not?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one of the things that I loved, and this was like a detail that it didn't occur to me until I read your book. But as somebody who, again, I keep going back to this, who was a kid who was watching X-Men the animated series and who had read the comic books as a 9, 10, 11-year-old, 12-year-old child, I viewed myself as a future Jim Lee. Like I loved Jim Lee. I used to sit there with pen and pencil for hours drawing Wolverine, Cyclops because I loved his art so much. And of course, when X-Men the animated series comes out, it's like mirroring those costumes, those outfits, the Jim Lee design of the X-Men. And it wasn't until I read your book that I guess as an adult that occurred to me that at some point in time in production there would have been a debate about that. Again,
Yeah.
as a child, and you're just glossing over, you see comic that turns perfectly into animated series and off you go. But there actually was a bit of a discussion behind that.
Absolutely, because there were so many incredibly talented artists at Marvel over the 30 years we had to look back at, that worked on the X-Men. And it just happened that our art people, there was a Jim was popular currently when we were making this discussion. So it wasn't like, well, we're going to bring back this look from 25 years ago. Current comic book readers would be comfortable with him. And our animation professionals on the art side were so aware of what it take, the different needs of animation versus a comic. You have to move stuff. It has, where you're gonna get pixelation. How do the colors go? And the kind of detail that you don't have in animation because it's so expensive. You can spend all day drawing a panel of a comic. That's okay, but you can't do that thousands of times for 1/2 hour. You have to simplify. And they immediately saw, look, Jim's stuff's popular. It's clean. We like it. We like other people's, maybe slightly better, but it fits for animation. It will simplify and pare down and work beautifully in because they'd been through dozens. Larry and Will had been working for 10, 15 years in the business. They'd been through nightmares of, okay, we get a beautiful design. We can't animate that. We could try, we could board it out and send it overseas. It can come back looking terrible. So they had an instinct for whose stuff would animate best, and Jim was at the top of the list.
However,
However, the story that we got that Will and Larry got a note like 3 months into our production when we'd finished most of the scripts and most of the storyboards. Oh, by the way, you have to throw this all out. We can't use Jim's style.
and suddenly
It was like on a Friday, like, oh, damn. Because there's no internet, there's people that have cell phones. We just said, okay, we're gonna have to go back to square one. We're already behind, and we've been told we have to redesign the whole show. And it was just simply, you know the story. I mean, Jim and the other guys left Marvel, and so somebody at Marvel was getting petty and didn't want to support somebody that just left the company, a competitor. So Will, in his wisdom, said, okay, you want to see something different? And he drew some really terrible stuff and submitted it with a straight face and said, okay, here's an alternative to Jim's style. How do you like this? And everybody lost their, other artists and Stan and everybody's going, what the hell's, So by Monday, they said, okay, I guess you can use Jim's stuff. But it took Will slapping their faces like that and possibly getting fired over doing it for them to say, okay, this is stupid. We're not thinking right. All the creative people want to do it the Jim Lee way. Just because he's now a business competitor doesn't mean we should change the show. So that was one of those moments.
Yeah, and it worked out. I think in terms of the way the show worked, having those costumes the way they do conveyed something about the character.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like in combination of that, and we started the podcast off talking about the opening sequence, and I love the opening sequence where it briefly displayed every character, their name, and sort of their power, and then
Yes.
through those costumes, like had you gone like old school X-Men, and they all had a very very similar costume, it would not have conveyed it near as much as the way it was done.
Yeah, yeah. That the creative decision we made was trying to make the characters as distinct from each other as we could, and that was just a selfish. It's easier to write good stories that way. If again, if you got six Smurfs and a Smurfette, what do you give, or six GI Joes and a GI Jane? What dialogue do you give to who? But these people, they were drawn so differently, they moved differently, they spoke differently, and it just made it really helped us writing. And we fought for it from like day one to keep them as distinct as possible.
And like Julia said earlier, that there's so many strong females in it too. It was almost 50-50, that almost the same amount of men and women, and it was great.
Yeah, yeah.
I do find it interesting because I remember being at the Uncanny Experience and sort of like listening to the lecture that you gave on it. And it was so interesting to hear the stories that came back of like your back and forth with Fox, over what can be aired and what can't aired. And that always stuck in my head because I remember as a kid reading the books, watching the show, especially when you're dealing with a character like Wolverine. Like here he has these adamantium claws, but obviously in an animated series he's not going to go toe to toe with humans and really use those things because there's no way the network's going to let that air. So there has to be a lot of sentinels and robots and cyborgs and those sort of things.
Yeah, yeah. And it part there were some downsides to being a children's show in the 90s because of restrictions. I mean, uh sometimes the guns look kind of silly,
Because they couldn't look real.
yeah, you couldn't look real. The guns couldn't look real. And you're blowing up cities, and yet you can't punch anybody. You can't cut anybody. There can't be any blood. The only blood we had was like the first couple episodes where Wolverine's got a little bit of a scratch from Sabretooth. That's the only blood in 76 episodes. They didn't want us to say the word kill very much. The Hellfire Club had to become the inner circle because you couldn't say the word hellfire. I mean, there were just hundreds of rules about children. Many of them our censor, who's a wonderful lady, Avery Coburn.
Yeah, she deserves Avery Coburn.
She let us push the envelope as far as humanly possible within the rules of children's programming. The fact that we were able to kill Morph in the first story was amazing to all of us. The fact we were able to do a Nightcrawler episode that was all about serious episode about faith was because other shows were just they just could be told no, 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 not even worth discussing. And Avery there'd be a back and forth for a week and say, well, if we do a show about faith, what are some of the rules we need to try to abide by, and how far can we push it? And she said, this is very cool because that's she knew the books. That's who that character is. So yes, of course you've got to do it, but let's be careful and respectful. And so that took give and take from both sides, but almost any other censor we've worked with wouldn't have never had the conversation. You just would have said no. And then the show would have been that much weaker for it.
I do have one that when we were going through old paperwork, I found a memo. If you can remember in the second season, at the end, they're in the Savage Land and that dinosaurs and big things and big fights. And there was on one of the checks that Avery had sent over, there's stuff's blowing up. People are fighting each other. Mutants are going toe to toe. There's volcanoes. And at one point, a dinosaur falls into a volcano. And okay. And she writes, I'm going to need to see the dinosaur come out of that volcano safely. And it's like, that's the point you want to make. Okay.
And she stuck by that one. I mean, that dinosaur doesn't get toasted.
Doesn't get toasted.
He gets out.
Mm-hmm. Or she,
whatever. So yeah.
I love this. And even though you guys did have to like tone it down or write it a certain way, I think you did it beautifully because it has shaped so many people like Finch and I's age into some very sane adults that know how to live some amazingly nice lives because you helped us understand things as children, and then as we're getting older, we're like, oh yeah, like the golden rule and like treating people with respect. I learned that from you guys for what you did with the animated series. So it's just, even though I know you had to jump through hoops, you still did it great because you raised a lot of people in a very great manner.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank
Really,
you.
God
Thank you
almighty,
so much
thank
for
you.
that. It's, it's funny. Uh, we talk about the nature of the stories, and both Mark and I were big into heroic stories, and that takes a certain amount of, moral attitude. But big, historical epics, westerns, war movies, things where people are tested, and whether, and they stand by each other or they don't, and so that we just, for whatever reason, had a real, weakness for those. We programmed films together in college, so that's where we met.
By programming in college and for films, that means back in
In the olden days, that means getting prints of films shipped to your college and showing them in theaters.
because there was no
There was no
VHS.
home video.
Yeah.
But so that was just kind of a default position for us. And there's something similar in, I think, in Star Trek, where the people writing that, and we're all of the writers were Trek fans. There's a certain, well, we're out here to do the right thing, and we're going to be tested. And are we going to fall short, or are we going to betray each other, or are we going to sacrifice for each other if we need to? And that just, it flowed through into the story choices we'd make without even thinking about them.
Mm-hmm.
Very famous, important Western, The Wild Bunch.
Of all things, at the time in 1969 was decried as the most violent movie you've ever seen.
Rated R, and William Holden and this stellar cast. But even when it came out, and there's all kinds of violence, couldn't curse a lot.
Yeah. So that's where the Wolverine curses cover. Mark and I were a bit of Peck and Paw fans, and so a lot, half a dozen of Wolverine's curses, egg sucking gutter trash.
You egg sucking piece of gutter trash.
Right.
That was
And
that was from The Wild Bunch.
Yeah, those were quotes from the '69 movie where they probably killed a couple hundred people, but they couldn't say bad words.
Yeah. And we couldn't either.
Yeah.
As a side note to that, I think anytime I rewatch the animated series, I can never get over Wolverine calling Gambit Gumbo. I don't know why. It just every time, come on, Gumbo, and you're just like, oh man, like it is so great.
Oh man, yeah.
But I think that in a lot of ways, Dylan nailed it on the head. I think that watching it much younger, you want sentinels, you want things blowing up, you want action. As you get older, you begin to appreciate, even subconsciously, I think, how much you were picking up sort of like those moral lessons, especially between the way like Xavier viewed the world and the way, Magneto viewed the world. And you begin to look at these characters whenever you're getting it, whether you're doing a Storm backstory or a Rogue backstory, a Gambit backstory, and you start to see that like hero with 1,000 faces, kind of like motif that comes out of that. I admit it's great because getting to enjoy it as a child, but there was such a layer of intellectualism to it that it was like, as I got older, I got to enjoy it kind of like on a whole different level.
Yeah. And that was one of the gifts that Fox, that Margaret and Sydney gave us, because, the writers out here in Hollywood we're working for hire. If we wanted to just write what we're going to write, you write a book and we'd sell 20 copies but if you're in Hollywood, you've got all this money throwing around and all these interests and possibly hundreds of millions of viewers. So you're writing for the people that are making the show possible. And a number of other times, the same talented group of folks would draw or write for a show and just be told, no, literally, dumb it down. You've got too many big words. The kids are going to turn this off. Stop writing for yourselves as adults and write for 7-year-olds. And then you'd even be a psychologist on saying, oh, well, no 7-year-old's going to understand, Wolverine and Scott and Jean's love triangle. So throw that on this here. So people tend to be timid out here and constricting. And the Fox people just looked at us and our writers and our artists and said, just make it as intense and dramatic and spectacular as you can, write for yourselves. And we'll let the chips fall where they may. And we hadn't been given that license before. We hadn't been given that opportunity before. So, man, were we grateful for 4.5 years of being able to do that. And we've tried on other shows. Our friend Larry, who was in charge of the drawing on most of this, I think he's worked on 95 shows. We've worked on 50 some. And some of them have been wonderful, some of them haven't. But this one, it all came together, right? The right people, the right property, the X-Men, the right time, the early 90s. Fox was just getting started. It all came to, it was like magic. And, unbelievable.
And here we are 30 years later talking with you about this show. I mean, that's pretty wonderful. That's pretty darn wonderful.
I agree. And I think it's so funny because as that 30 years has gone by, I was once a child who was being made fun of by his older sisters that you need to put those comic books away and stop watching those cartoons. And I'm about to text them after this and be like, guess what I did? So.
Yeah, that was it. Beast said, Beast enjoyed comics. Various people in the cast, some of them read comics, some didn't. But he said he used to.
You mean George Buza?
Yeah. Yeah, George Buza used to. He said he used to have to hide them like under the sheet, with the flashlight. And I think maybe he said he found some, comic classics like Ivanhoe and the comic book. They had some things like that, and that made his parents, who are a little bit more intellectual, happy. So okay, you're not rotting your brain with the normal comics. But yeah, so he laughed too about okay, well, look, Mom, Dad, look how I'm doing now.
All right, speaking of Beast, I have to ask this question actually specifically comes from my wife.
Okay.
Because it is one of her favorite scenes. It is season 1, episode 3. Beast is in his jail cell and he's reading Animal Farm. And the guards are making fun of him. Oh, he's probably looking at a picture book. He's probably looking at his relatives. My wife wanted to know whose idea that was because she thinks it's so brilliant. Oh, here it is.
That's absolutely mine. And it comes from something that happened in the 9th grade. I remember this specifically.
Oh, you opened a can of worms here.
Yes. Our gym class in 9th grade was right before lunch, and we just worked out and we showered and we're waiting to go to lunch. And we're sitting here in the bleachers. I'm sitting next to Charles Friedman, who was a really I don't know if he's valedictorian, but he should have been if he wasn't. And he's kind of a pal of mine. And the coach comes by. This is East Tennessee, and anything but like a chaw of tobacco in his cheek. He's, oh, look at old Friedman, because he was reading Animal Farm. Look at old Friedman. He's reading one of them kitty animal books, and just was. Big laugh at Charles at the valedictorian for reading the animal book. And I just hold my head and say, great coach. Yeah. And nobody explained it to him. Nobody said, no, coach, that's really a classic. And that stuck in my head. And so we try to think of stuff for Beast. You Could Never Go Home Again, Animal Farm. And I think there was some
Crime and Punishment.
And
specific title.
Yeah, that suited either him or the fact that he was in jail, and that one came up and made us all smile.
This has been 34 years of marriage. I'm not sure I heard that story before.
Coach Henson, no, not Coach, it was a different coach. Anyway, but it was great. Yeah, so thank you, Charles Friedman, wherever you are, for enjoying Animal Farm.
For enjoying what you enjoy and enjoying it when you want to enjoy it, not being embarrassed off of something.
Brilliant.
Hey, I didn't know. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Look at you, Finch. You're getting exclusives for a 34-year-old marriage.
Breaking news never heard before. Not even his wife knew.
The stories we keep.
Yes. So as we're kind of like getting to the end here, and I really, really hate to put Dylan on the spot here, but I have to ask, like this past September, you got to go to the first ever Uncanny experience in Minneapolis. Julia's got the hat.
I got the hat. I got the hat.
For somebody such as myself, again, lifelong X-Men fan, it was the experience of a lifetime. I have to ask from your perspective coming into it, how was the entire event for you?
I have never seen anything like it. It was breathtaking. It was.
It was so satisfying. It was, we've been to a lot of cons, and sometimes they're really tidy, and you don't, and and sometimes they're huge and overwhelming. But X-Men is a major, the animated show X-Men are a major focus of a lot of them, but this was just those people. A lot of them in cosplay, and so they sold maybe 900,000 tickets, and
Not 900,000
yeah,
tickets.
yeah. But so it was a contained area. But just Chandler and everybody just did such a cool job with such an amazing building that it absolutely did feel like, okay, we're in Xavier's mansion.
Yeah.
And the fun that he had with, make a pretend graduation and bringing Chris in.
Chris Claremont, ladies and gentlemen. Chris Claremont was there.
Just, I know it was difficult. It was the first time he's put that on, that it was a challenge. He didn't have a big budget. He didn't have a big staff. But it was really special. And so we hope that 10 years from now, we can look back and be at the 10th one of those, because I don't think he wants to stop. I'm sure that the Minneapolis club is going to be thrilled to rent it to them every year, because that was a great group of people. It wasn't like, people came and trashed the place. Everybody there loved it. It ran smoothly, which is pretty amazing for a first try. Just everything about that was a happy weekend for us.
It was immersive in a way that it's hard to describe.
And it made the fans happy. It made friends of ours came to it, relatives came to it, that guests of ours that never, maybe had been to a con or maybe only once. And it was larger than life for them as well.
Yeah, like you were saying earlier, Eric, the certain tiers of X-Men being big or not being big. We knew when we were making the first year that we had to have Chris Claremont. We could not do an X-Men event like this without Chris, but we also knew that we couldn't do it without the animated series. And you guys you're one of those tiers of X-Men fans, and then just for us to be able to have you guys and Larry Houston, and then we got lucky enough to get some of the voice actors. It was just you guys were a good large component of making that entire weekend happen. And that's why I'm so happy that we get to have you again for the second year. And yeah, you guys were a good portion of why that weekend went so well.
Thanks,
Just looking back at photographs from that, the image of Cal Dodd in his jacket on the bed, looking at the photographs, because they had a special Wolverine's room.
Yeah.
That was Wolverine's bedroom in the mansion. And you go, oh my God, this actually could be Wolverine's bedroom in the mansion. It was amazing. It was delightful.
And I have to say, speaking as a fan, it was insane. And people who haven't gone there have asked me about it, and I always tell them, like, I don't ever want to call it a con. The best thing I can describe it as family. It felt like a family reunion. That's legitimately what it felt like. And as somebody, I remember the very first issue X-Men I ever read was Uncanny X-Men number 216, 1989. Kid who lived next door handed it to me. It's the first comic book I had ever read. And after that, I was hooked. And it was like the amount of years after that where I read a comic, and right inside the first page, written by Chris Claremont. And at the time, you don't know who Chris Claremont, like what he looked like. There was no Google. You couldn't look up what Chris Claremont looked like or what his voice. It was a name. And then on top of that, all the years of watching X-Men the animated series, and you would see that Lewald name at the bottom. You couldn't Google what they looked like. You couldn't know what they. And then it was also like show up in a building, and both Chris Claremont and the Lewalds are in this building. I mean, I was literally back to being like 9, 10, 11 years old running around this building, except for the fact that I have a knees of a 40-year-old man, and it's a big building with a lot of stairs. But
That's wonderful. That's just flat out wonderful.
Yeah.
And for us too, it was very much, oh my, for us, it was like walking through the looking glass because there were all the X-Men. The folks, the fans, you don't want to call them fans, but the cosplay was a
Really
different
high level,
a different level.
was a consistently high level.
Yeah.
At a usual con, there's a whole variation of people that, man, that's spectacular. And oh, they just figured that out this morning,
Which is fine.
which is cool. You know, some casual, but there's some real passion went into the looks and the creations of the people that went there.
Mhm.
I know that we had so much after the first year, we asked for feedback from people who are like on our newsletters and everything. And there were so many feedbacks about you guys and how happy they were that you guys were there. And I'm sure you guys realized it because I'm pretty sure you like sold out of all of your books on like. So in case none of us at Uncanny had told you that, like you were a huge part of the feedback of how great the weekend was, because the show means so much to everyone.
Oh, great. Well, we look forward to many years of it. And my cousins aren't going anywhere. So it's always it's a good reason to visit family.
And I think I've officially aged into it. I think if I ever cosplay, I'm going to have to go as the president of the United States.
There you go. Yes.
Do
And
it.
I'm going to say right now, I've decided that she never got a formal name. She was just Madam President in the first season of the show. I've decided that her name is President Margaret Jean Louise Avery. And that is a salute to Margaret Lesh. That's a salute to Avery Coburn. And that's a salute to our two mothers in the middle there. So, and also Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
So that's my
Yes.
canon. That's my head canon.
What was
Yeah.
what
An
was
exclusive X-Men animated series thing happening 30 years later.
yes.
There you go, exactly. Animal Farm and the name of the president, right here, first time
That's
ever,
right.
folks.
And
First
I love
time ever.
I love the Scout to Kill a Mockingbird reference because what was Scout's
Yeah.
last name?
Oh my God! Pinch!
Ah,
Yeah, one of
Wow,
my
boom.
favorite books. My father was a literature professor, so
oh,
yeah.
there you go.
Well, then it's got to be.
It's
gotta
gotta be.
Between the four of us, we can make that name stick. Okay.
Absolutely. Tweeting it, hashtag it's over. But we're gonna wrap this thing to a close. I want to say, first of all, say thank you so much to Dylan, my good man, for coming in and co-hosting this thing. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric and Julia, if you do not have their book, get it. Personally, I say this illustrated one because there's so many neat things that are packed into this thing, and the thing that I love is the back of it.
Oh yeah, the
Thank-
villains.
All
Thank you,
these
Larry
great
Houston.
villains. I mean, you
Thank
got
Rick Holberg. Yeah.
yeah, Sabretooth, Omega Red, two of my favorites, absolutely. But again, thank you so much for coming on the very first episode. If I don't get to talk to you again in the future, we will definitely see you at sophomore year of Uncanny Experience. And
Yes.
once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
Oh, can I say, as we're wrapping up here,
Yeah.
X-Men TAS for X-Men the Animated Series. That's us pretty much across the board, like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. If you want to find us, that's how you can find it. And it's just us. It's the two of
Yeah,
us.
nothing much else.
Yeah, about that. So, yeah.
Yes, can't stress it enough. Go give them a follow anywhere you can. It's been a joy following you. Like every time I see one of your posts, I'm like transported back to being a child and being like, oh yes, I remember. So yeah, any X-Men fans out there, fans of the animated series, by all means, definitely check that out. It's not hard to go into Google and just search their names and see, all the socials and everything that pops up there as well.
Good. Okay.
All right.
Good.
All right.
Okay, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too.